Hi, I'm Christoph, and today we'll be looking at procedural crosshatching, line, and screen tone shaders. I'm going to explain how to make each one of these, but if you just want to use these shaders and test them out on your models, you can download them using the link below in the description. First, we'll be making a shader for little hatch marks. Next, we'll make a couple of crosshatching shaders. Then we'll make a line and a screen tone shader. And finally, we'll be making some gray underpaint to combine with these. So let's have a look at some examples and then we can get started. But before we do that, I want to give credit and a shout out to Sam Bowman's Procedural Note series. One of his wonderful tutorials gave me the base for the crosshatching shader, and I've really enjoyed his research into the world of procedural textures. His channel is really worth a visit, and I'll link it in the description below. The first example I want to show you is this lovely link model from theStoff on Sketchfab. Yes, that's another Christoph. And it used a combination of little hatches with the patch hatching shader and combined with the gray underpaint. This is really my favorite shader because it really has that hand hatch feel and I think it looks great. To map these hatches onto the model, I use UV mapping. I think some will say that it's not ideal, but so far I could get great results just by using the basic UV mappings like Smart Cube and Spherical Projection. The shader is really dependent on the light sources, so it really works well to play around with them. But also you can go into the shader itself and there's a gamma and a contrast setting that will further help you enhance the light if need be. Next up, I want to show you this screen tone shader in a manga style, and I'm using Ruki's Otoro Shidare model. If you haven't seen her Blender models and insanely talented work yet, please go check her out on Twitter. She was generous enough to share a demo model with the BNPR community, and you can download it, and that's what I'm using to test the screen tone shader with. For this one, I've combined my gray underpaint and my screen tone shader, and I combine it using a multiply, and this gives some control over how dark I want the shading to look, and then I also use this in combination with the different gamma settings. I just use a different instance of the shader on different parts of the body, and then I just tweak them until I'm happy with the results I'm getting. Of course, there's also a control for the size of the diamonds, and you can get some vastly different results with these. One thing I want to point out is that this uses the window texture coordinate node, and this is dependent on the ratio of your window. So when you want to go and render, it's best to get into your camera view, and as you can see, it distorts this diamond scale, and you have to set the ratio for the diamond scale the same as your camera. So for instance, we're rendering at 1080 pixels by 1920 pixels, and that is actually a ratio of 3 to 4. So we're going to leave this at 3 and we're going to set the Y at 4, and as you can see, this gives us a correct shape for our diamonds when we render. Having to adjust the ratio is a bit annoying. If you know a workaround, please let me know in the comment section and then I can share it with other people. But once you get the shader dialed in, I hope you agree you can get some great results. So without further ado, let's dive into Blender and let's start building some shaders. Let's start a new blend file. We're going to delete everything in the scene. Let's add a plane. And we are also going to add a UV sphere. And we're going to set it to shade smooth. Let's dive into the shader editor. And we are going to add an emission shader. We're going to call it base hatching. and we're also going to apply it to our sphere. The first thing we are going to do is add a wave texture. Let's plug it in. Let's set it to 10. And this is going to provide us with the hatching. And we're going to add a color ramp set to a constant. And this will allow us to control the width of our hatching and gives us a nice, sharp, and clean edge. Also, there are distortion controls, so you can get a little bit of variety by using this, but we're going to keep it to a minimum for now. The next thing we want to do is to rotate clusters of these hatches, and we're going to do this with a Voronoi texture. So let's add 2 Voronoi textures. The one below we're going to keep as is, and the one up we're going to set to distance to edge. Let's add a mapping to our wave texture node. And we're going to set texture coordinate to UV. Next up, we're going to add a vector matte node set to multiply. And we're going to plug the color of the Voronoi into the vector. We want it to be grayscale, so we're going to add a color ramp, which is a lazy way of making it grayscale. And then we're going to plug the multiply into the rotation of our wave texture. And if we now manipulate the Z vector, we can rotate our hatches. And it will cluster into this Voronoi pattern. Let's set it to 2.6. And then we're also going to mix in this second Voronoi texture. Let's add a mix RGB node. And let's plug in our Voronoi texture. Let's add a color ramp. And let's turn this color ramp around. And so this gives us a total control over the edges. We're going to leave it like this. And we're going to set this mix to screen. And last but not least, to control this base hatching, we're going to add a mapping and texture coordinate node to both our Voronoi textures. And we are going to add an input value and connect it to our scale. We can call this cluster size and label it. And if we set it to something like 7, and then we can do the same by adding an input value and adding our wave texture. Let's set it to 50 or 20, for instance. And we can also give it a name. And this will be the base for 3 of our shaders. So let's select this, set it aside, and let's copy paste it. Let's click on our new shader and let's call it Little Marks. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a mask to mask out little dots of these hatches. And we're going to add them before this screen. To do this, we're going to add a noise texture. We're going to add a mix RGB. We're going to set the color to white. Let's use the noise texture into the FAC to use as a mask. And then we're going to add a color ramp. And so this color ramp now controls our noise. Let's set our noise to 10 or something like 20. And now by playing around with the color ramp, you can get different masking effects. And this gives us our little marks or little hatching shader. We can go back to our controls, and we can also get different results by playing around with the scale of the hatches. Also, if you want bigger hatches, we can go to our color ramp, and we can always play around with that one as well to get more of a dramatic hatching effect. And that's our first shader called Little Marks. Next up, we're going to select our base hatching. Let's copy paste it again. And this time we're going to call this texture Patch Hatching. And we're going to select everything up to the screen. And let's just copy paste it in. Let's mix it in using a mix RGB node set to multiply. And we can do this a second time. Let's also set the mix to multiply and set it to a max value. So this gives us 3 instances of our base hatching. We're going to go to our second cluster, to the location of our Voronoi textures. And for location, we're going to set it to 5. And this is going to mix the different hatches with each other. And for the third one, we're going to set it to 10. We can also mix the cluster size. So I'm going to set one to 6. Another one I'm going to set to 5. You can even vary the hatching scale if you want to. This looks good. Let's have a look on our UV sphere. I'm going to edit my UV sphere and set it to a cube projection. I often use Smart UV Project or Cube or Spherical Projection, and you can get some basic UV projections that work well, even with more complex models. And now we're going to turn this shader into an actual shader with lights. So let's add a sun. And we're going to add, after our multiply and before our color ramp, we're going to add a diffuse shader. Let's add a shader to RGB node. plug it into a color ramp, and let's mix it in. And we're going to use linear light. Let's set our linear light to a high value. And now if we play around with our color ramp, we get this shaded effect. If you think the edges are too clean, we can always go in and let's add a mix node, and let's add a noise texture. And this noise texture will break up the edges. Let's set it to soft light. And as you can see, this breaks up the edge, but the scale is a bit too big. So let's set it to something like 30 or 40. Yeah, that seems about right. And this gives us a better control over our edges. Now we can get a vastly different result by play around with our color ramp. But this is the basis for our patch hatching shader. And that's it. Let's move on to our next shader. We're going to copy paste our base hatching again. And this one we are going to call Interlocking Crosshatching. What we're going to do is we're going to copy paste all of the nodes up to the screen like last time, and we're going to copy paste them again. Mix them in. Going to use a multiply. And we are going to set, first of all, we're going to set our multiply to a max value. And then for the Z rotation of our first cluster, we're going to set it to 2. And then our second rotation, we're going to set to 4. I don't want these channels in between, so we're going to set the screen to a lower size, a lower value, maybe just a little bit. And as you can see, the hatches are really blending into each other. And to get more control over this, we can add a color ramp after our wave texture. And we can bring it down, and this gives us more of a control over this. Same thing for our other wave texture. All right. And just like last time, we're going to turn this into a shader with lights. So let's add a diffuse, shader to RGB, a color ramp, and a mix RGB node. Let's set it to linear light. Let's plug these into each other. And this gives us our interlocking crosshatch shader, which is a bit sharper and less chaotic than our patch hatching shader. Next up, let's make a dotted line shader. So I'm going to copy paste our base hatching. Let's call this one dotted line shader. And I'm going to delete everything except the emission shader. Let's add a wave texture. And let's plug in a color ramp. I'm going to set the wave texture to a scale of 50. And let's also add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. Let's set it to UV. We're going to set the Z rotation to 30. And then we are going to add a noise texture. Into a color ramp. And we're also going to mix it in. I'm going to set the scale to 60 and detail to 0. And then we're also going to add a color ramp with a constant after the mix. To see our sharp lines. And let's set the mix to screen. Let's set the screen to max. Lower the color ramp on the wave texture. And let's set up our color ramp. And this gives some broken up lines. And now we're also going to turn this into a shader with lighting. So let's add a diffuse shader, a shader to RGB, color ramp, and let's mix it in using a linear light. Let's set the linear light to max. And let's adjust the color ramp of the diffuse. And that's it. That's our basic dotted line shader. You can play around with the size of the wave texture and also the size of the noise texture to get, oh, this is too much, to get some different sizes and effects. Next up, we're going to make a classic cross-hatching shader. So I just copy pasted another plane and UV sphere. Let's call this one crosshatch shader. And I'm going to delete everything except an emission shader. We're going to start this off by using a wave texture into a color ramp. And we're going to set the scale to 30 and the distortion to 3. And this gives us these distorted lines. Let's add a mapping and texture coordinate node and set it to UV. And now I want to break this up. And to do this, I'm going to use another wave texture. So let's copy paste the texture, mapping, wave, and color ramp. And let's mix it in. And we're going to mix it in using a screen. Set it to max. And now we're going to set the scale to something like 6 and distortion to something like 20. and we adjust the color ramp so it gives us these breaks in our lines. One more thing, I'm going to set this X value in the upper wave texture to a diagonal. Next up, we're gonna select everything up to the screen and we're gonna copy paste it and we're gonna mix it in. Let's add a mix RGB node. Let's mix this in using a multiply. Set it to max value. And our third mapping node for the wave texture, we're going to set the rotation to 90 degrees. And we want a different distortion, so we're going to set it to something like maybe a crazy value, something like 75, and then scale to 14. And this is really going to break it up. That's maybe a bit too much, especially on the scale. You can play around with it until you think it looks good. And then to make these very sharp lines, I'm going to adjust the scale just a little bit. Maybe 5 is better. And we're going to add one more color ramp with a constant to get some sharp edges on this one. And this creates a crosshatch shader that is a bit more irregular or a bit more distorted. If we turn off the distortion, it just creates this very boring pattern that doesn't look hand sketched at all. So that's why I use the second wave texture to create something that looks totally irregular. And I think it works really well. So let's have a look on our sphere. Yeah, that looks right. And now we're also going to turn this into a shader that has some shading with light. So add a diffuse, add a shader to RGB, add a color ramp, and again, let's add it in using a mix node and set it to linear light. You can adjust the color ramp. And that's it. That's our basic cross-hatching shader. Let's move over to our next shader. Next up, we're going to create a Manga screentone shader. So again, I'm going to start from a plane and from a sphere. I'm going to call this one Manga screentone. And again, I'm going to delete everything except for the emission shader. So for this one, we're going to start off with a Voronoi texture. And we're going to set the randomness to 0. And we're going to set it to 2D. We're going to add a color ramp. Set it to a constant. And this will control the size of our screen tone. Let's add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. Let's put the Z rotation to 45 degrees. And now, depending on whether you want dots or diamonds, you can set the Euclidean to Chebyshev. And this will create a diamond shape. Next up, we want these diamonds to always look at our camera. And to do this, we're going to set it to window. But this will also stretch our diamonds. So we're going to have to rescale our diamonds. And for this, I'm going to set it like 4:1 ratio x to y. And then I'm also going to set the scale of my Voronoi to 30. A constant seems to be a bit too hard. When we use our window mapping, it creates these pixelated edges. So I'm going to set it to linear. And let's just adjust it that way. And this gives a bit of a smoother transition for the edges. We can further set the scale to what we want. Maybe something like 70. Yeah, it's starting to look nice. Now, to turn this into a shader that reacts with the light, we will do the same as before by adding a mix RGB node. Let's add a diffuse. Let's add a shader to RGB and a color ramp. Plug it in. And we're going to set it to linear light. I'm going to scale the screen tone. And this is sort of the effect I'm going for. I think this looks nice. And let's try it out with the dots. Yeah, that looks nice as well. One more tip. When you're rendering, it's best to set the x to y scale to the same ratio as your x to y resolution. And then when you render, just play with the settings until you're happy with them. This shader is going to work well together with an underpaint shader that we're going to make next. For this one, I'm just going to use a UV sphere. Set it to shade smooth. Let's start off by deleting the principled BSDF. Let's add a diffuse. Let's add a shader to RGB. And let's plug it into a color ramp. And so what we're going to do is we're going to catch the light. And then we're going to use this to make sort of a gray shader. To do this, we're going to use a gray and a white color code. And then we're going to set a gray in between. We're going to drag it all the way up to the white to get this sort of effect. It's almost like you're using some hard lines as a constant, but it creates these tree tones. But it's softer. And I'm going to call this one underpaint. And when you use this one in combination with all of the other shaders, it looks very, very nice. We can also add a gamma, and then we can control the light a bit more by just using a slider. And that's it. We've now created all of the different shaders in this tutorial. I will link to the tutorial files in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know in the comment section. Please like and subscribe. And I hope to see you next time.